Hi everyone. I'm here to chat with you about the causes of reading disability and the role of language impairments. This is the lecture that you would be receiving actually right at this moment because it's 5 o'clock. The purpose of recording today's lecture is because this is material that you'll need for your take-home exam next week, which we'll talk about in a second. And to help us stay on track so that we don't lose time, we are going to forge ahead and do everything we were intending to do today, this week, online together. So the first thing, there's a few things that we're going to do. First is go through this lecture, but before that we are going to talk about an emergent literacy activity. What we would have done in class is break up into groups and review the children's books that you were asked to bring to class. What you're going to do instead, if you go to Canvas in the Week 4 module, so I'm in the LLD course, Week 4 module, and here for Week 4 you have the notes here that go along with the lecture you're about to hear. Eventually this video will also be posted here, but since I'm doing it right now, it's not quite posted yet. Then there's the Emergent Literacy Book Activity, which is this Word document I'm going to walk you through. Then we have the required reading for everybody today. Then you have the discussion article here. The quick sheet from the Tuesday group is here. The discussion board is here. So your classmates who were the discussion leaders for this week are going to lead you through the discussion on the discussion article. I'm sorry, on the discussion board. And so Emily and Hannah and Melissa will be leading us through that. I'll be monitoring that discussion board, but they'll be primarily responsible for facilitating that discussion. They'll be posting a few clarifying points about the article, as well as some questions to spur discussion. Your responsibility as an audience member is to respond to at least one of their posts. Every student must post something. You can post, and the directions are here on the discussion board. Let's see if I can get this to come up for us. You can post a response, an answer, comment, or thought to a question that is posted by your discussion leaders. You can post a question to the discussion leaders, or to me. You can post an answer or comment to a fellow classmate's post. So if someone posts something that is similar to what you were going to post, you can still make a comment about that, build on what they were saying, or make a comment that supports what they were saying. Or pretty much any other kind of comment or post that I'm not thinking of at this moment. So anything you do on that discussion thread is perfectly acceptable, but everybody must submit something. And so that is how I'll be taking attendance and participation this week. The other thing that everybody will have to do is submit to me this emergent literacy book activity, and that is this Word document. So what you will do is just fill out the book 1 column. You can ignore book 2 and book 3. So you'll fill out book 1 column. You will list the title of the book you're reviewing, and then you will tell us 3 or more emergent literacy skills or concepts that could be targeted in a one-on-one, small group, or large group activity. So in addition to listing the 3 activities, please be clear as to how you intend those activities to be used: one-on-one, small group, or large group. They can all be one of those. They can all be large group or all be small group, or you can do one of each. It's entirely up to you. The more important thing is that you post 3 skills that are specific to the book that you're analyzing. So what I'm really looking for here is, beyond just saying you could do print referencing with this book, what about that book makes print referencing interesting? Is it different fonts? Is it different locations? Beyond print referencing, how can you be specific to that book? And then I'd like you to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being useless and 10 being the best. This is purely subjective, so this is not something that you'll be graded on. This is just something that was going to be a class-based activity that allows me to say that we have in fact had class by doing these kinds of activities. So scale of 1 to 10, and then what I'm going to do is compile all of these at the end so that you have a resource of books, of children's books and their ratings, and some skills and activities that you can do with each book. So you'll have that resource compiled at the end. And you'll have that from both your section and from Friday's section, so you'll have all of them. And it's okay if there's overlap. That's not a problem at all. And you won't be rated, you're not going to be graded on this at all, but I'm not going to think poorly if you use a book and then you think, oh my gosh, now that I really think about it, I would rate this book as a 1 or a 2. It's terrible. That's completely fine. The more important piece is that you're thinking about it. So that is the emergent literacy activity here. I went ahead and I'm sharing with you the book that I would have shared. It's much more fun when you can see it in person, but this is my favorite children's book. It's called The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss. And so anything by Dr. Seuss is great because it has rhyming, and I had pages tabbed that were going to show you the explicit rhymes that are in there. But what's interesting is in the Sneetches book, they rhyme real words with non-words, which you may know from Dr. Seuss that he does that quite a bit. And so how I was specific to the Sneetches book is that we have the opportunity for rhyming, but then also talking about real words versus non-words, as well as real versus pretend animals. And then on each page of the Sneetches, the text is in different pages, so it's not on each page. So it's not always the case that the text always appears at the bottom of the page or always at the top of the page. It's in different places every time, so I think that is helpful for print referencing purposes. And then one of my personal reasons for liking this book so much is it really helps to work on S-blends. And so for our kids with speech sound disorders, this is a really helpful book whenever they're working on S-blends because they get a lot of repetition. So that's my evaluation of my book. So I look forward to seeing all of yours, so you can post them to the Canvas Dropbox, which I have not created yet, but I will create by the time you're listening to this. So the next thing is the take-home exam. So next week for LLD, we do not have class. That's February 17th and February 20th. And class was canceled on February 17th as a result of President's Day. And so we were not planning on having class Tuesday anyhow. So I canceled Friday's class to give us time to do a take-home exam. The exam will be posted online Sunday, February 15th. I have a take-home exam policy that is posted to Canvas that you can take a look at that has a lot of details. You will be presented with 4 essay questions. You'll choose 2 of those to answer. Each answer should not exceed 3 double-spaced pages, and you cannot answer more than 2 questions for more points. So only 2 questions need to be answered. Each answer is 3 double-spaced pages. Each question is worth 15 points, so this project is worth a total of 30 points. Each answer must cite 2 sources. For each question that I have posted, I give you 2 suggested sources, so places where you would find that information. It's not required that you use those specific sources. You can use anything you'd like. Let me zoom this in a little bit maybe. They're not mandatory to use those. Please feel free to use your own, but websites are not acceptable. So like thespeechmom.com or something like that is not acceptable. You'll be graded on both form and content. I'd like you to re-review the writing lecture that we went over last semester in preschool. Make sure you proofread your submission, read it out loud, because I promise that helps, as I've told you probably multiple times now. February 20th, which is Friday, from 1 to 3:45, I'll have open office hours to answer any questions regarding the take-home exam. Regular office hours will also stand, at least, if I'm allowed to have office hours due to the snow. So as long as we have school, I will have my office hours, which are Mondays 3 to 4 and Wednesdays 2 to 3. As well as a special open office hours 1 to 3:45 on February 20th, which is Friday. I realize some of you have your placements during that time. No problem. If you need to talk to me, I assume that you will explore other options to do so. The take-home exam is due via Canvas on February 22nd by midnight. It's the same due date for both sections because both sections get the exam posted at the same time, and you have all week to work on it. Okay, so as I said, there's a take-home exam policy on Canvas that has a lot more details about the take-home exam and what's expected, so please feel free to read through that, and if you do have questions, let me know. But let's get a move on here, shall we? Okay, so the purpose of today's lecture is to talk about the causes of reading disorders. And so as an overview, information from the Katz and Kami chapter 4, you'll see that there's extrinsic causes and intrinsic causes. So extrinsic causes are environmental, and intrinsic causes are based on what's internal to the child. And I realize you can see my notes here, so I'm just going to try and scoot this up. There we go. So in some cases it may be somewhat odd to think of an environmental factor causing a reading disability. And that's true. So limited research has suggested that a child without previous exposure to literacy skills will in fact struggle with literacy skills. So of course, if they have not been taught and they've not had any exposure to that, they will struggle with literacy skills. So that may not necessarily be an obvious cause, perhaps, because it's not something neurological or something that's outside of the child, or that's intrinsic to the child. But those are very obvious in some ways causes for reading disability. So it is very much a possibility for a child to have a reading disorder caused by lack of exposure to reading. The good news is, because it's lack of exposure and not something intrinsic, we can usually provide services that can help to remediate that. That there may still be a delay, but we can usually provide services that remediate that. So the remainder of this lecture is going to go into detail of the extrinsic causes and the intrinsic causes of reading disabilities. So, extrinsic, the first one we're going to discuss is early literacy experiences. Now, as I mentioned, this is particularly detrimental for children who already have the risk factors that make them vulnerable or susceptible to a reading disorder. For your average, typically developing child, their early literacy experiences will not cause a reading disability. Research has supported the importance of joint book reading, but there has not necessarily been a strong connection for later reading outcomes for the general population. That is to say, we know the importance of joint book reading and all of the amazing skills and activities that we can incorporate into skilled book reading, but it's not the case that there has been a lot of research showing that for the average child, if they do not receive joint book reading experiences, that they become a child with a reading disability. Does that make sense? And so what we're saying here is that, in particular, joint book reading is helpful for every child, but it's not going to lack of that is not going to cause a reading disability for the average child. Children who are at risk for reading disabilities and children who have language impairments are a different population. So for those children, not having early literacy experiences in combination with being at risk for these other factors really makes it so that their early literacy experiences could be a cause of a reading disability. So similarly, the next extrinsic cause is reading instruction. So pure reading disabilities are characterized by those that exist in the presence of adequate reading instruction. So as we talked about when we thought through individuals who have dyslexia, we thought about kids who have average intelligence but have poor word reading. And so it's in the absence of any difficulties cognitively, and it is in the presence of adequate reading instruction that we consider that to be a cause of a reading disability. It's assumed that second graders have received appropriate instruction, so that doesn't really account for individual differences. And in fact, part of the reason that RTI was developed was to rule out the kids who received poor instruction, because we wanted to be able to provide a way of determining who truly has a reading impairment and who has lack of instruction. So by using something like response to intervention, we were able to provide an intervention to children, see if they respond, and if so, we could provide them with the skills they need to return back to the classroom and not need special instruction anymore. If they do not respond to the instruction, it could be that even though they had poor instruction, or perhaps they didn't have adequate instruction, it could also be more than that. And so it could be the case that they do struggle with reading beyond the fact that their instruction was inadequate. So instruction can improve reading skills but may not necessarily cause a reading deficit. And as a result, we need to be thinking about the intrinsic causes at that point. So we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so for the third and final extrinsic cause is Matthew effects. And so those of you who may be familiar with the this is like a biblical reference here, that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So there's this gap that widens over time. And so children who struggle with reading, as we've talked about, don't want to read. So they find it difficult, they find it cumbersome and tedious, and so they don't want to do it. So they have limited practice because they don't do it, and they have poor motivation because they don't want to do it, and there's low expectations. They don't expect, individuals around them don't expect them to become good readers, and so there's a low expectation for them to be successful here. So it's this downward spiral of difficulty when they are struggling with learning to read and struggling with the ability to read. They don't want to do something that's very difficult. And you can imagine there's things in everyone's lives that are difficult and make it so that we don't necessarily want to be involved in them. And so as a result, we get limited practice and we're poorly motivated. So children with reading problems do read less than proficient readers, and they read less challenging text. And so over time, as we talked about, this not only affects reading, but this affects their language abilities. So they're not exposing themselves to more challenging text, which is where we see an increase in vocabulary complexity. So if they're not having those experiences, they're not exposing themselves to advanced texts, they're not getting that complex vocabulary input. And so not only is their reading ability affected, but their language abilities are also affected over time. And so that's where that gap widens, or when we talk about that gap widening, that's how that's happening. So it's not just that over time they just don't get better. It's that without that exposure, they're not acquiring the language skills that other kids are acquiring. And so their vocabularies aren't advancing, their grammatical skills aren't advancing, their narrative skills aren't advancing as a result of not having exposure to reading. And so this is basically saying what I just said, because reading is a source of new vocabulary, of advanced grammatical skills, and of discourse knowledge. And so that gap continues to widen the less exposure that they have. Okay. So one of your supplemental readings for this week was the Rice 2013 article about SLI and genetics. So it's really a fascinating article if you do have time to read it. But this begins our discussion of intrinsic causes of reading disability. So we reviewed the 3 extrinsic causes, which were early literacy experiences, reading instruction, and Matthew effects. Now we're talking about the intrinsic causes. The first one is genetic. And so research has shown that having a sibling with a reading disability put a child at a 40% chance of having a reading disability themselves. Having a parent with a reading disability put a child at 30 to 40% chance of having a reading disability. In twin studies, they looked at identical versus fraternal twins. So identical twins are monozygotic, one egg that splits. They had a 60% chance of sharing a reading disability, and dizygotic, that's fraternal twins, so 2 different eggs, they had a 40% chance. So you may think that there should be a higher chance of shared reading disabilities in identical twins in particular, and you're right to think that. But genes don't act alone. So this is not just a genetic issue. There are other factors that contribute to whether or not a child who is at a genetic predisposition for a reading disability will actually become a child with a reading disability, and it's a lot of the extrinsic factors that we've already reviewed. So the likelihood is much higher, but it doesn't confirm anything concretely. It's still certainly a possibility for that child to become a successful reader. So Steve Petrill at Ohio State has done a lot of great work. He has a huge database of twins. I can't remember how many pairs of twins, but I think there's something like 300 or 600 pair of twins. And so he's looked at how genes influence skills, and he has found that genes do influence initial skills, but shared environments is truly what influences the growth. So this is a nature versus nurture type of idea, that even though genes will influence the initial skill level or the nature of a reading disability, over time, their experiences in their environment, their extrinsic experiences or nurture, are actually what's going to influence growth in reading abilities. So there has been some work looking at specifically what genes could be contributing to reading disabilities. So they've identified them, but so far they only account for about 1% or less of the variance we see. And for those of you who heard my, I think everybody at this point heard my spiel about using statistics to rule things out. So we're able to put variables in a statistical model and examine how much percentage it contributes to what the cause is. So I drew a pie graph on the board, and we talked about what variables we could put into a statistical model to look at what was contributing to these outcomes. And so genes were found, but they only accounted for 1% or less of that pie, if you can picture that. So that's really not a whole lot. So even though this is something that contributes, and there's definitely a genetic component, the gene itself doesn't account for a lot of variance at this point. So we need to continue to do research to look at what's happening here. So the next intrinsic cause is neurological. A lot of research has examined the left hemisphere as the locus of deficit for individuals who struggle with reading. There's various structures that have been speculated to be responsible for reading disabilities. There's been a lot of amazing research using different functional imaging strategies to look at what structures within the brain are causing reading disabilities. So a lot of the temporoparietal areas are suspect because they are strong in language base, and also some occipital and posterior areas of the brain due to visual processing. And so you may be thinking, well, I thought dyslexia was not a visual deficit, and it's not. Dyslexia is not, but individuals can have visual processing deficits, as we'll talk about in a few slides here, that may contribute to difficulty with reading. So as you can imagine, if you have a visual impairment or a visual processing impairment, that does not mean you have dyslexia. That means you have a visual processing impairment, and that can cause difficulties with reading. But truly, the majority of the research has concluded that it's very likely a combination of structures that vary based on the type and the severity of the reading impairment. So if there's a language impairment comorbidly occurring, if there are other comorbid syndromes or disabilities occurring, depending on the severity of a reading impairment, it's very likely that there's a combination of structures and this kind of varies based on individual differences. So it makes it a little bit difficult to determine, but they have been able to hone in on broadly these areas here that could be suspect for contributing to language impairments. Reading impairments. What's interesting is that it's unclear at this point if brain defects cause reading disabilities or if reading disabilities cause brain defects over time. So this back and forth relationship here is questionable. We don't know the relationship of these two structures, of reading difficulties and brain defects. And so some research have suggested, obviously, that a brain defect is the reason why a child has a reading disability. And other researchers suggest that because a child has a reading disability, that causes brain defects over time because of the lack of exposure to language and the mixed input that they're getting, or the low quality of the input that they're getting. So the next area we'll talk about in a few, we have a few slides that talk about visual. The next intrinsic area is visual. And there were a few paragraphs in this chapter talking about possible visual deficits. Most of them were considered to be untrue and not supported in the research and not being connected to reading disabilities at all. But we'll go through them because you may experience patients or parents who have heard of these and think that it's the cause or cure of a reading disability. So the first is reversal errors. This occurs in normal development. It's not a visual issue. Most research has suggested that it's a failure to remember letter order. So this happens. Many kids reverse letters. So they can do B and D like we've talked about. They can do saw instead of was, or was instead of saw. This was not found in the research to be any more typical in children with reading disorders than it was in typically developing children. And the research did conclude it's not a visual processing issue, but rather it's a failure to remember the letter order. And so that's a really important takeaway here, is that even if these reversals occur, it happens with normal kids until about second or third grade. If it's happening beyond that, it could be indicative of a reading disorder, but it's not a visual processing deficit. It's the failure to remember letter order, and this could be based in a phonological deficit. The next visual piece is erratic eye movements. And so individuals with reading disability have been shown to have more fixations, shorter saccades, and more regressions during reading. And saccades are those rapid eye jerks that we see happen during natural reading. But research has really suggested that abnormal eye movements may be a result of reading disabilities and not a cause. So it's not these erratic eye movements are causing reading disabilities, it's the fact that a child has a reading disability that's causing the erratic eye movements. Training eye movements does not, I guess I didn't finish that sentence there. Training eye movements does not result in improved reading. And so there was no research to support that even once they trained the eyes to move in a specific way, that reading improved at all. Okay. The next two visual-based possible causes of reading disabilities. One is SSS, scotoscopic sensitivity syndrome. And this is, you may have seen or heard about individuals using different colored overlays, different colored glasses or filters, literally rosy colored glasses. They've been purported to eliminate this particular syndrome because this syndrome causes oversensitivity to particular frequencies of light. And so by using colored filters, it was suggested that you could eliminate those troublesome wavelengths. However, individuals through the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Ophthalmologists have both recommended or both strongly discouraged the use of this approach as it does not contribute in any way, shape, or form to reading disabilities. So there's very little support between SSS and reading disabilities. That's not to say that this syndrome doesn't exist. It does. It does exist, but it does not affect reading. And so using different colored glasses and different colored overlays are not going to improve reading ability at all. Transient processing deficits. There's been some conflicting reports about this. This is looking at the global visual features that guide eye movements over time. So there's been a mild connection to reading disabilities. About 29% of children who have a reading disability have also had transient processing deficits. Again, more global visual processing deficits here. There's been conflicting reports though, and again, it's if there's any visual aspect that contributes to reading, it could possibly be this one, transient processing deficits here. And the reason that there's been conflicting reports, again, is because it doesn't occur in every child who has a reading disability, so it's definitely not always the case. So it's not a primary cause. It could be something that co-occurs with reading disabilities that makes it so that some individuals in particular struggle with following along in a sentence, and they benefit from part of the words in a sentence being covered up in order to process. So that's not a cause of the reading disorder, but more of this transient processing deficit that is co-occurring with the reading disorder. So I think it's something to keep your eye on, literally, because it is possibly something that we could be thinking about in the future. I don't think we know enough at this point to say whether or not we should be exploring that further, but we definitely don't know enough. So we need to at least look and see why there are so many conflicting reports. So the next intrinsic cause is auditory processing. So we've talked a lot about auditory processing deficits. This here is a link to a YouTube video by Paula Talal, and she is a big researcher in the auditory processing world. So she has faced a lot of criticism though. So I think it's something to take with a grain of salt. It's a fairly long video. I think it's like maybe it's 20 minutes or so. And I've watched several segments of it. I think it's worth a watch, especially if you're interested in auditory processing. But again, there's been a lot of inconsistent reports, and so Dr. Talal has faced a lot of scrutiny as to supporting auditory processing as a primary cause for reading disability. And I don't know if you've heard about some of the programs like Fast Forward and Aerobics. I know some of you are planning on presenting those to our group, but those types of approaches are what she suggests will be helpful for improving reading. And so there may be some truth to that, but at this point, there's been so many inconsistent reports that it's hard to say. It's a possibility that there are subgroups of children who have a reading disability and also an auditory processing deficit. So it's definitely a possibility that these are, again, something that's co-occurring. But auditory processing ability has been weakly related to phonological awareness and reading skills. So at this point, it's just not the case that we're thinking this is the primary cause of a reading disability. But as a part of an auditory processing disorder, kids often struggle with the prosodic features of syllables, and so that may be a promising explanation as to why they struggle with auditory processing, because they have difficulty perceiving rapidly occurring sounds or changes over time. The next intrinsic cause is attention-based deficits, and these are characterized by inattention, impulsivity, overactivity. We see these as labels with ADD, attention deficit disorder, and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is definitely not a primary cause of a reading disability, but it often co-occurs. And it actually overlaps more with an inattention-based deficit as opposed to a hyperactivity. So if you see individuals who have a diagnosis of ADD, if it is, and they don't have the hyperactivity piece, they are more likely to have difficulties with reading. Not that ADHD isn't, but there's several types of ADHD, and the ADHD that is characterized by more inattention and impulsivity, those are the kids that are going to struggle with reading more than an ADHD that is more strongly characterized as a hyperactive case. But as you can think about the attention and memory that it takes for you to read your grade level text, so the textbook that we're reading for this class or for other classes, you need a lot of sustained attention to be in a class for 3 hours, to read a college level text. So attention is definitely not something to ignore. It's not a primary cause of a reading disability, but if a child has ADD or ADHD in conjunction with a reading disability, we're definitely going to see a lot of deficits, and they're really going to struggle. And so we definitely want to be paying attention to what their needs are and providing them with compensatory strategies that allow them to be successful in the classroom by monitoring what their attentional needs are, when they need a break, what helps them kind of release that hyperactivity if needed, so that they really can try to sustain some attention during reading-based activities. So finally, we'll talk about language-based deficits. So as you can imagine, for us, this is a huge aspect to reading disabilities. Approximately 50% or more of children with language impairments in kindergarten go on to have reading disabilities. Language is one of the few constructs that we've reviewed here that may truly be a causal variable for reading disabilities. So a lot of the intrinsic and extrinsic variables that we've talked about so far, we've said, well, these aren't really a true cause of reading disabilities. They may co-occur, or they may be speculated to be a cause, or we may think this is, there's an aspect of this that contributes to reading difficulties. Language is different. Language is the one construct we know for sure has causal relationships with reading. Language deficits can also be a consequence of a reading disability. So think back to those Matthew effects. Think back to this gap widening over time that may result in language problems. So it could be the case that a child first has a language impairment and then has a reading impairment, but it can also be the case that they have a reading impairment that over time, based on the Matthew effects, based on that low motivation, lack of exposure, lack of practice, that they then become a child who also has language-based deficits because their vocabulary isn't advancing, their syntax isn't advancing, their discourse and narrative skills are not advancing. So it's not just that it's causal, but it could be bidirectional. Three huge aspects of language that contribute to reading are phonological awareness, phonological retrieval, and phonological memory. Phonological awareness we know pretty well at this point. It's sensitivity to the sounds within the language. It's a very strong predictor of later reading skills. It's a common area of deficit for kids with dyslexia. And the great thing about phonological awareness is that it's very responsive to instruction, especially when it's paired with phonics. So this is definitely something that we can work on directly with kids, and we know we can see results. Let me blow this up here. Phonological retrieval. This is word finding skills necessary for object and picture naming. So kids who have difficulties that have a lot of word substitutions, so they might accidentally say, chair instead of table, so they're substituting words that are within the same semantic category. They have a lot of circumlocutionary speech, so they're talking around their concepts, or they use a lot of vacuous words like this or that. This is problematic in dyslexia, so we may see this as a double deficit, phonological retrieval plus phonological awareness deficits. So they have a hard time naming words, plus they have a hard time manipulating the sounds within the language. And this is often measured by rapid automatic naming. You'll hear that called RAN in the literature, or a confrontational picture naming task. I have an example here to show you. So these are some examples of how you would measure rapid automatic naming. Having the child start here and naming all the letters in a row, O, A, S, D, P, A, O, S, P, D, naming all the numbers, 6, 4, 7, 9, 2, 4, 6, 7, 2, 9, naming objects, flag, drum, book, moon, wagon, flag, moon, wagon, book, drum, naming colors, blue, red, green, black, brown, yellow, red, black, blue, sorry. So you'll see that this is a way to measure that phonological retrieval, if they're able to quickly name objects, letters, numbers, colors. Oh, I forgot to put another link. Another way that this can be measured is through what's called a Stroop task, and this is an example of a Stroop task. And what's happening here is you see words that are semantically referring to a color, but are orthographically represented by a different color. And what you're supposed to do during this task is read each word, say the color of the text, and not read the word. So here you would say red, blue, green, yellow, green, black. And so what you're trying to do here is inhibit the decoding response and really get at phonological retrieval. It's very difficult to do, as you can imagine. Blue, red, yellow, black, yellow, blue, green, red, black. It's more fun when we can do it together in a group, but you get the idea. And finally, we have phonological memory, which is the ability to store phonological information. This is often a deficit for poor readers in combination with a deficit in phonological awareness. And this is often measured by a non-word repetition task. And so I have a clip here, but I've played it for you guys before. It's the non-word repetition task from my dissertation that I shared with you. But often what we're asking kids to do is to listen to non-words and repeat them back. So we might say juke, chan, tatch, and the child would have to say back juke, chan, tatch. So these are three huge language skills that contribute substantially to reading abilities. So our discussion article for today will be discussed on the discussion board, so please make sure that you head over there and offer some comments to Emily and Hannah and Melissa, who will be guiding us through. And our required reading for this week was Katz, Adloff, Hogan, and Ellis Weismer. And this was an article in the ASHA Journal JSLHR, and it won Article of the year that it was published. It's a fantastic article, and it really posed an interesting question, which is, are SLI and dyslexia distinct disorders? So they posed three models. Let me blow this up for you. They posed three models that they thought could possibly help to explain the relationship between SLI and dyslexia. So we know that for SLI, kids have poor language but normal nonverbal IQ, and for dyslexia, kids have poor word reading but normal IQ. And so what they looked at three models of suggesting the ways that SLI and dyslexia could be related. The first one is that perhaps there's a core phonological processing deficit that results in, where's my mouse? That results in a less severe disorder, which is dyslexia, resulting in word reading problems. And that as a part of that, there could also be a more severe phonological processing deficit that results in SLI, which in turn manifests itself as word reading problems and oral language deficits. So this was the first model that they were exploring, that there's one core phonological processing deficit that presents itself in two ways, less severe, which is dyslexia, more severe, which is SLI. The second model, they thought perhaps there is a phonological processing deficit, or perhaps there's other cognitive deficits. So the phonological processing deficit could still present in two ways, dyslexia, which results in word reading problems, or it could become SLI, which results in both word reading problems and oral language difficulties. Or it could be the case that there's other cognitive deficits at play that result in SLI, and that in turn manifests itself as word reading problems and oral language deficits. Model 3 suggests that there is a phonological processing deficit that contributes to dyslexia, resulting in word reading problems, and there's other cognitive deficits at play that result in SLI, not a phonological processing deficit, and that turns into oral language difficulties. And what they found was that Model 3 was supported, so that there's a phonological processing deficit that results in dyslexia, which presents itself as word reading problems, and then there are other cognitive deficits that result in SLI that presents itself as oral language difficulties. So are SLI and dyslexia distinct disorders? Yes, they are. In this study, which you may have noticed is the same I guess the discussion leaders may have noticed, is the same population of children as the Katz, Fay, Tomlin, and Zhang article. That is your discussion article for this week. So this is a large longitudinal study that was conducted in Iowa. So what they found in this study was that 25% of children with SLI in kindergarten had a diagnosis of dyslexia in 2nd through 8th grade. So they followed up in 2nd, 4th, and 8th grades. Other studies have now followed up in 10th and 12th grades, and I believe these kids have now graduated high school. But 25%, this was approximately 25% because it depended on how liberal the selection criteria were, depending on what scores they used for IQ. But broadly, we can say that approximately 25% of kids with SLI in kindergarten will go on to be dyslexic later, which is to say that that's not a very high percentage. So we would expect if these were disorders that stemmed from the same deficit, or a similar deficit here, this would be a much higher number. But because they are coming from two different places, this is a phonological processing deficit and this is other cognitive deficits, that's why it's the number of approximately 25, which I think the range was more like 17 to 26. So this is even a very generous description, but it depended on how IQ played in, what you read in your reading of it as well. So phonological processing deficits were found to be specific to dyslexia. SLI in isolation did not have weak phonological processing skills compared to their typically developing peers. So as you'll recall from your own reading, they had a group of SLI only, a group of dyslexia only, and a group of comorbid kids compared to a group of typically developing. And so when a child had SLI in isolation, there was no weak phonological processing skills. Those kids with SLI in isolation did just as well on phonological tasks as their typically developing peers. So this does truly highlight this model here, that dyslexia is more of a phonological-based deficit and SLI is stemming from other cognitive-based deficits. We still need more work to find out what exactly those are, but we do know how it presents itself as oral language difficulties. And so on this particular graph, figure 2, from that particular article, looked at phonological awareness performance of subgroups in kindergarten, 2nd, 4th, and 8th grade. And so this is a phoneme deletion standard score. So we have standard scores which you know range from approximately 50 to approximately 130, with 50 being incredibly low. So 70, if you remember, the mean is 100 with a range of 85 to 115 as normal, 70 being 2 standard deviations below the mean. So here we have those kids at kindergarten, 2nd grade, 4th grade, 8th grade. The gray bars are normal. The black and white bars have comorbid SLI and dyslexia. the black bars have dyslexia and the white bars are SLI and isolation. So as you can see, at every grade level, let's look at just SLI and isolation. At every grade level, these kids perform within the average range on a phoneme deletion standard score. So this is probably around 92, that's normal, around 100, a little over 100, around 105. So they're doing completely fine on phonological based tasks. Now look at the kids with dyslexia. In kindergarten, they are subclinical, so maybe like this is maybe 87 or so of a standard score, and then it just goes down over time. So their phonological processing actually decreases over time. The kids who did the poorest were kids who had both SLI and dyslexia, scoring below all three groups at every turn. So having both a cognitive-based deficit and a phonological processing deficit was a very severe deficit for them. Okay, so that's all I have for our lecture today. Your next jobs are to fill out the emergent literacy form for one book, giving us about 3 or more, if you'd like to, emergent literacy skills or concepts that could be targeted. And then head over to the discussion board and post at least one comment or question to one of the threads that your discussion leaders will post. So those are the 2 things, in addition to listening to this, that you have to do in order to be counted as present for class today. So if you have any questions, please send me an email and let me know. And gosh, I hope I see you next week. Stay warm.